Good evening. Welcome everyone to Institute of Social and Cultural Studies webinar. This is the first webinar of new word series which is devoted to the topic of Russia-Ukraine war. I'm Mohammad Hosseini Moghadam, the faculty member of Foresight Department in the Institute of Social and Cultural Studies. I'm happy to be your host of the first meeting. In this series, we are going to look at and examine emerging events and trends around the globe and their impact on culture, science, and society, including the potential for progress to decline in both good and bad manner. I would like to say some technical point. Our webinars are recorded and they are going to be into our website. You can have access through www.iscs.ac.ir. To ask a question or to make a statement, and we do encourage you to do so, use the chat function, put forward your question or your statement in the chat, then I will be able to select you into the webinar. Well, today, as I told, we host a debate on Russia-Ukraine war. We are joined by two guests. As is our custom here, we will introduce our guests from Foad Izadi, the closest to our institute, starting in Berkeley, Northern California, with Ramon Grosfoguel. Ramon is Associate Professor of Latino Studies in Department of Ethnic Studies at University of California, Berkeley, United States of America. Ramon is internationally recognized for his work on decolonization of knowledge and power, as well as for his work in international migration and political economy of the world system. And in Tehran, we are joined by Professor Foad Izadi. Dr. Izadi is an associate professor at Department of American Studies, Faculty of World Studies in University of Tehran, where he teaches Master of Science and PhD courses in American Studies. Fuad received his PhD from Louisiana State University. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Economics and a Master of Science in Mass Communication from University of Houston. Dr. Izadi research and teaching interests are focused on United States-Iran relation and U.S. public diplomacy. His recent book, United States Public Diplomacy Toward Iran, is familiar for the member of political science community. We welcome you both to an Institute of Social and Cultural Studies. Professor Ramon Grosfoguel, let's begin with you. What is your analysis of main factors that led to the war between Russia and Ukraine? The floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank the Institute for Social and Cultural Studies. I also want to thank the Farabi International Award on Humanities and Islamic Studies for the prize I received. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I want to talk about the conditions of possibility of the historical processes that led to this war. We need to go back a little and talk about the decline of the U.S. empire. The U.S. empire is facing challenges, very strong challenges, military challenges. They have lost the wars in the Middle East, commercial challenges. They're losing the commercial battle with China in Africa, and they lose already the commercial battle with China in Asia. They face a decline, economic decline, because the US in the last 50, 60 years have dedicated their resources for military investments. That is, the US government, the federal government of the US, has spent half or more than half of the federal budget in Defense Department. The Defense Department, as you know, is linked to the U.S. military industrial complex. So a lot of that money ends up in companies that live off corporate welfare. What I mean by corporate welfare is instead of welfare for the people, welfare for the corporations. So what the US government has been doing for decades is transferring taxpayers' money to military companies that live out of wars. So if there is no war, they invent a war. They need wars to make money. Uh, so this is one factor that is there uh, that can help us understand the decline of U.S. empire. The debts created by this waste of money into wars and into um, military industrial complex from taxpayers' money uh, is leading the USA to become the number one country in the world with the largest deficit. USA, as you might know, has above $30 trillion in debts. And the problem they're facing is that they've been living off creating all these debts by transferring resources to corporations, in this case, the military industrial complex. Also, letting big companies and banks and Wall Street people to get breaks in taxes. So we're having a situation now over at least 40 years of tax breaks to the rich and transferring tax resources from workers and middle classes to not to the welfare of the people, but to militarism, to military industrial complex, all these companies that make money out of war. And so this has led to a situation where now uh, they are facing a big crisis. Uh, the crisis during all these years, all these deficits were growing, and the way they caught up with the debts, the way they tried to deal with the debts was by selling US bonds. China was one of the main partners there, purchasing billions of dollars in bonds of the USA. That's how they managed to uh, deal with the deficit of the federal government. Uh, Now we're in a situation where, because of the US aggressive policies towards China, towards Russia, towards Venezuela, towards Iran, towards many countries around the world, putting sanctions, and anything, if they don't like a government or they don't like whatever, they immediately put sanctions and start uh, isolating these countries from the international financial markets and structures. So creating very difficult situations for these countries. Uh, and because of that, now many countries are moving away from the US dollar. Uh, Now many countries are now beginning to do trade internationally with uh, with other currencies. Uh, as you know, the US backed off from the gold standard in 1971 with the Nixon administration, and they start printing paper money with no backup in gold. And the way they did it was by backing up the the value of the dollar into becoming making of the dollar the main currency in international trade. The mechanism used for them was to for the countries that trade with oil uh, to sell their oil in dollars. That's what is called petrodollars in the international markets. And they did an agreement with the Saudis in the early 70s to trade all their oil only in dollars. That's how the US managed to keep dollar as a as the top currency in the world by making of the dollar the standard of other currencies. Instead of the gold standard, now the dollar becomes the standard. But this is now declining very fast because the US was able to deal with their debts and all of that by selling bonds based on the issue or on the confidence that the dollar is a stable currency. So many people invested in the bonds, and that's how they managed to balance the deficits by creating more debts. But what happened now is that their debt is above $30 trillion. And now the many countries around the world are moving away from the dollar because they can see the problem of printing money. Because now, for example, China is moving away from purchasing bonds from the US. It's on the contrary, selling the bonds and trying to move away from this bond structure of the US and moving fast into the gold standard. That is purchasing gold and backing up the yuan into with gold. The same thing Russia has been doing the same thing, and many other countries. They're purchasing gold and sustaining their currency in gold, while the US is just printing paper. And that paper is now becoming devalued because the more paper you print, the less value it has. And so, and given the debt, the deficit they have, and that now a big power economy such as China is not purchasing bonds, is putting now the USA into a tough position because now they've been living off selling bonds to balance off the deficits. But now, if China or other countries stop buying bonds, then we're talking about a catastrophe for the US empire, economic catastrophe, because then they won't be able to balance up the budget. Then, if they cannot do that, then there's going to be a big crisis, a depression, probably worse than the 1930s of last century. There's going to be a collapse in the markets, and we're going to see difficult times for the U.S. empire. U.S. empire is a declining empire. I always compare a declining empire with a tiger that is in a death, is being injured and is in a terminal death situation. A tiger in that situation can become very dangerous because it can start just, doing moves in a sudden, unexpected way that could be dangerous for humanity. And so I am very concerned about the way U.S. empire has been behaving in relation to the crisis, because they're really doing crazy things. And now let's talk about Ukraine. In the context of decline, USA needs to recover markets, needs to recover its power again. And recover its power means recovering economically at a world scale. And so they are, one of the mechanisms they're trying to do now is use their military power to try to impose themselves, okay, and do geopolitical moves around the world that are very dangerous to recover markets that have been lost to other emerging powers, such as China, Russia, and other countries. And so they have declared China as their main enemy at a world scale, and Russia as their immediate enemy. So in the long run, they define China as the main enemy. In the short run, they define Russia as the main enemy. This is documented in documents that you could see in the administration of the USA. You could see very clearly during the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has continued with this policy until now. They haven't changed the doctrine developed during the Trump years. And And this has been also said before by other administrations. During the Obama administration, during other administrations, they were uh, defining China as the main enemy. And in a sense, they tried, they lost the wars in the Middle East. And so this is, they lost the war in Afghanistan, they lost the war in Syria, they lost the war in Iraq, for example. I would say, even though they're still there, they have lost the war because they don't have a full control over the country, and there is a strong resistance there, and so on. So all these wars are for the USA right now waste of time and money, and they are entering into big deficits. It's just developing more deficit for the U.S. Although the 7 military companies are making a lot of money. That's what they did in Afghanistan. 20 years there, destroying a country, killing many people, and then in the end they have to step out because they lost the war. They were beat up by the Taliban, and now they are. They wasted their several $trillions, and all that money went to 7 companies. So it's becoming a main problem in the US. People are starting to see this problem, and there are reactions going on in the country. So in the context of that, what the US is doing is, and you could see this in the Rand Corporation document of 2019. I invite everybody to see this document. This is online. You could download this document. It's called Extending Russia. Extending Russia. That's the title. That document is still online. You could check it out. If you want to see the script of the film that we're seeing today in Ukraine, you have to read that document. That's a very central document to understand the strategy the US is developing in against Russia. You could see that we are 3 years. That's 3 years ago, but it's online. You could still read it. And what they're doing is the following: they've been provoking a war in Ukraine. They've been provoking Russia to intervene in Ukraine for a long time. I mean, this is not new. This is not something that happened in this year when the Russian Federation decided to enter into Ukraine. There is a history behind this that if people doesn't know, they should know, because otherwise you won't understand what's going on. The war in Ukraine is not a war of Russia against Ukraine. It's a war of the USA against Russia and China. We need to understand that. And against the European Union. This sounds crazy what I'm saying, but I will explain you why the European Union is also an enemy for them. We need to understand these things. Otherwise, we are lost in the geopolitical map of the world today. So, first of all, let's begin with Russia. What the US has been doing is surrounding Russia, the Russian Federation, since the 1990s, with military bases in the borders of the Russian Federation with Eastern European countries, and with missiles in each of these bases pointing at Moscow. Okay, put yourself in the shoes of the Russians. If you are in Moscow, you're in any place of Russia, and you see the NATO, which is the military branch of the US empire, expanding all over the border of the Russian Federation, constructing their military bases with missiles, nuclear missiles pointing at Moscow. Okay? Then, that was since the 90s, they've been doing this. Even though the Cold War was over, or was supposed to be over in 1991, and there were agreements, both with Gorbachev and after that with Yeltsin, during the Soviet Union with Gorbachev, during the Russian Federation with Yeltsin in the 90s, there were agreements that the NATO will not expand into the borders of the Russian Federation. But that's exactly what they did. They violated their promises, and they kept expanding all over, surrounding the Russian Federation, even though for the Russian leadership, it was a shock because they thought that now they're capitalists. Now they were supposedly they were planning to integrate themselves into the European Union. Even they were even talks to integrate Russia into NATO. I mean, all this
Raymond,
stuff was
sorry.
going on, and they. I'm
Would
sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would like to ask you if we have a lot of question from you and Fuad, and we would like to know your idea about our questions. So, if it is possible, I would like to ask you to answer to somehow briefly to our question. To
Okay, I will.
yeah,
Okay, I will do it. The only problem with that is that there's a lot of context that you need to put into the question to understand the answer. But anyway, I will then jump and not talk about the context. Okay, I will now uh, tell you exactly what they're doing and forget about the context. Okay, but I just want to say to the people that are listening that there is a history behind this. There's a coup d'etat in 2014 where the U.S. put Nazi militias in power in Ukraine, and there's been a provocation going on until today against Russia. The strategy of the USA is the following: the strategy of the USA is to 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 provoke Russia into a war in Ukraine, to then justify sanctions, to then replace Russian companies that represent 40% of the European Union imports. Okay, the imports of European Union is international imports. 40% are Russian companies. It's a lot of money there. So they put sanctions using this provocation against Russia in Ukraine, where Russia have no other choice than to intervene to Ukraine to then take over the companies, the markets away from the Russian companies and replace them with American transnational corporations that are selling to the Europeans uh, with monopoly prices. And by doing that, they're on the one hand sanctioning Russia, trying to hit Russia uh, economically, and hitting China at the same time because the Silk Road passed through to Europe, passed through the Russian Federation. So they're expelling China and Russia both out of the European market, and now they're taking over the European market by displacing the companies of Russia in gas, oil, aluminum, uh, wheat, and many other items. And so now they're making a big money, and then they're forcing the European Union to put 2% of their national budget, each country, into purchasing military weapons from U.S. military complex, from U.S. military companies. So the companies, the military companies, are very happy, and many companies in the U.S. now are making a lot of money in Europe and selling at monopoly prices to the Europeans, where Europeans now are suffering hyperinflation. And this is what they're doing. They're just it's a chessmate in what the U.S. did at the geopolitical global level, without moving any soldier, and they're just were able to do this displacement of Russia, isolation of Russia, pushing out China from European markets, and now they're recolonizing Europe. They have recolonized Europe. This is all planned and written in the document I mentioned of 2019.
thank you, Raymond. To somehow I understand from Raymond answer that this war actually is kind of product which has been made by USA to confront international actually to confront the losing of international competitiveness in terms of economy, in terms of market against China, USA competitors around the globe, China, Russia, and European Union. Uh, okay, I would like to bring in Fuad to answer the next question. Fuad, as a foreign policy expert, what is your perspective on how this war can end?
Well, I benefited a lot from Professor Raymond's
Could you please turn
talk.
it down here?
I think what he said is quite important. You need to look at the context in order to understand what is going on. And the title of that 2019 RAND Corporation report, it's, if I remember correctly, it's overextending and unbalancing Russia. So the idea of the report is uh, talking about how to unbalance Russia. And when you read the report, you remember Iran, because a lot of tactics that it's proposed in that report is what the United States has been doing to Iran in the last 43 years. Now, your question was the idea of how to end the war. You know, as Dr. Ramon said, it was the United States policies that started the war. And Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of the Islamic Republic, in the meeting that he had a couple of months ago with President Putin, actually mentioned this fact that if it wasn't, if Russia did not defend itself and did not take the measures that it took, the West would have started the war. And this is something that you will realize when you look at the context. So the basic fact is that in order to answer that question, we need to answer another question, whether the United States has achieved all its goals when they created the setup for the war in Ukraine. And the answer is no. I remember I was in Doha for the Doha Forum in January, and we had a senator from the United States talking about the idea of the Ukraine war ending properly. Not just ending, they are not interested in ending the war, but ending it properly. And what that means is that all the political and economic reasons for starting the war should be realized before Americans would allow the Ukrainians to actually start serious negotiations. And if you have been following the recent developments, you realize that it is the Ukrainian side that's refusing to talk, refusing to negotiate. And the reason they refuse to talk and negotiate is because they don't have permission from the United States. And as Professor Raymond correctly pointed out, the government that is in Kiev is a government that came out of the 2014 coup. And as you remember, in 2014, the United States did not have to engage in the policies that resulted in the coup. They could wait 1 year until 2015, and in 2015, they would have had an election in Ukraine. The presidential election was scheduled to take place in 2015. So why did they not wait for 1 more year? And if they wanted to overthrow the government in Ukraine, they could do it through normal political process. So why didn't they do it? The reason is that because of the large Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, whoever was in power in Ukraine would be either fully in line with Russia, the bigger neighbor, or they would be sympathetic to Russia and try to have good relations with Russia. Because in a normal democracy, you could not win in Ukraine unless you had positive contacts with the very large Russian speaking population that was in the east of the country. And the Americans realized that they cannot win through the normal democratic process. They could not install a Western oriented government if we had democracy in Ukraine. So they realized the only way they could achieve their goals in Ukraine was to actually orchestrate a coup. And I was in Romania about 3 months ago, and it was very interesting for me. The former Romanian foreign minister, after he finished his tenure as the foreign minister, he became Romania's representative in the EU Parliament, and it was in 2014. So when the disturbances in Ukraine started, he was part of a delegation. He was actually leading a delegation to investigate what was going on in Ukraine. And he was presenting this at the conference I attended, that initially the demonstrations in the Ukrainian capital were peaceful demonstrations, and they were dying down. As you remember, in 2013, there were two economic packages available to the Ukrainian government. One was given by the Russians, and the other one was given by the EU. And the Russian package was much more attractive. So the Ukrainian government at that time basically went with the Russian proposal, because any independent government would do what is best for the country, and the Russian proposal was a better package. And of course, the Europeans and United States had been working in Ukraine in terms of trying to basically orchestrate the color revolution dating back many years. And so they had NGOs, they had contacts, they had people who were ready to basically work with the West in terms of trying to start a color revolution process. So those organizations and individuals got active. They started the demonstrations, but the demonstrations were peaceful until one day, and you remember the news at that time, you had Western media outlets and other outlets talking about people getting killed in the Maidan, in the main square in Kiev. So it was a sudden shift from a peaceful demonstration to people getting killed. And this former Romanian foreign minister was saying that when they investigated the killings, they found out, this is a report they produced for the EU Parliament. He said, in our report we wrote that the people who were killed in the Maidan were shot by snipers who were placed in the buildings surrounding the Maidan. And when they looked at who were these people, they investigated the people who were engaging in shooting citizens. They realized they were not Ukrainians. They were foreign mercenaries trained in Poland by the United States. So what happened in 2015 was an orchestrated bloodshed. They orchestrated a scene to make peaceful demonstrations turn into bloody demonstrations. And then they blamed the government for the killings. And the end result of that project was that many people got killed by these snipers that were trained by the United States in Poland. And then that started a coup. You needed to have people getting killed to start the coup. So I mean, this is 4 or 5 months ago when I was in Romania. listening to this former foreign minister. And then you know what's happening in Iran in the last 3 months. So you see a lot of common tactics of trying to create deaths. We had in cities, is one example, the snipers coming and shooting at ordinary citizens and then blaming the government for the people who have been killed. So you see some of the tactics are quite similar. And when the United States go through this much difficulty of orchestrating a coup and then not allowing the Ukrainian government that came after the coup to have any sort of settlement with the Russian government. You know, we had the Minsk I agreement, Minsk II agreement. Every time you had the Russian president, you had the German chancellor, you had the French president, and the Ukrainian president agreeing on a peace settlement, the Ukrainians would not do their part. And this resulted in basically not reaching any sort of peace settlement from 2014 until February of 2022. In that period, 8 years, we had 14,000 people killed in eastern Ukraine. This is a UN report, and 80% of these people were Russian speakers. So we had a civil war before the war of February 2022. We had a civil war going on in eastern Ukraine. Of course, the Western news outlets totally ignored the civil war and the killings because they did not want to admit that the government of Ukraine that came to a coup is actually killing its own citizens. So overall, I think the more we go forward, we realize the true intentions of the U.S. government, and it is the U.S. government that will decide when the war will end, and they will decide when they think they have achieved their goals or when they think that they're paying a price that's more than what they have. So let me stop here since I talked too long and we benefited. Professor Raymond, let me say that since the beginning of your talk, we had Dr. Reza Gholami, who is the president of ISCS, present in the room. You're not going to see him because you're seeing me only, but he's in the room paying close attention to your talk. And so we are honored to have him here.
Thank you. Fuad, let me ask another question. Do you think this actually war is kind of new battlefield between East and West?
Okay, I can answer the question maybe, but since Dr. Ramon is in California, maybe we go back to him.
Okay.
And then because we want to listen to him more, because I'm in Tehran, I'm available to you anytime you want.
Okay.
And then, so let's benefit from his insights, and then I can come back.
Raymond, I would like to get your answer for this question. You may have a specific definition of victory. According to your definition, I would like to know if Russia has a chance to win this war. If your answer is negative, can it be said that Russia defeat means strengthening American unilateralism in the world?
Okay, well, we need to understand, out of my previous intervention, is that the U.S. cannot compete internationally in the economic markets. They have lost the technological battle. They have lost it because they have spent and waste trillions of dollars into warfare. So while in the last 50 years, U.S. was investing money into warfare, the other countries were spending their money in improving technology in production. So today, the U.S. cannot compete with China. They cannot even compete with Russia. They cannot compete with many emerging economic powers in the world. And so we're moving into a multipolar world. So this is why the US are moving away from the unipolar world of the USA. And so this is why the USA is doing these dirty wars because they cannot compete economically in the law of the markets. They have to recover markets by doing international coup d'etat. Okay, and that's what happened in Ukraine. It's an international coup d'etat of the USA. But in order to displace Russia and China from European markets, and in order for American companies to recolonize Europe. And that's what they've done. They recolonized Europe. Europe is now underneath, now subordinated like a colonial protectorate, okay, of the USA. They have subordinated themselves to the military instructions of Washington through NATO. They have now lost sovereignty. They have no sovereignty vis-a-vis the USA. And not only that, now a lot of the European companies, industries, they're now closing down because they cannot survive with American monopoly prices in oil and gas. So this is what's going on. It's an international coup d'etat by the USA because they cannot compete with the regular laws of the market. So they are using dirty tactics in order to recover markets. And that's what they've done in Europe with the war in Ukraine. This we need to be very clear. Now, the war in Ukraine is a war between the new multipolar world and the unipolar world of the USA. This is a very important question because it's about the future of the world that is being fought in Ukraine right now. If the US wins this war, we're talking about the strengthening of the unipolar world of the USA that do not respect sovereignty, do not respect countries, do not respect other cultures and people, and are imposing their will by using piracy. Piracy. This is the term we have to use. Is piracy, international piracy. They violate their own rules in terms of markets, in terms of institutions and laws in the world economy, such as United Nations laws, such as any law, they violated and are doing piracy. What they're doing to Russia now, they have done to Iran for 43 years. They have done to Venezuela in the last 3 years. And they've done this to Cuba for 60-something years. And they've been doing this for a long time with many other countries. And now we're facing a situation that is dangerous for the world at large because the new multipolar world of China, Russia, Iran, India, and many other countries that are joining is respecting sovereignty, is respecting the people's cultures around the world, and is, in a sense, applying the rules of market and commercial trade in the world in a respectful way. The USA is just using piracy because they cannot use the laws and the practices of the world trade, commercial trade, because they have lost the battle. They cannot compete. So that's why they're now using piracy to impose themselves all over the world. And so what are the possibilities here? I don't think Russia is going to lose this war. Russia is too powerful. Ukraine, even with all the aid and help that the NATO is passing on and the US passing on to them, I don't think they have a chance to win the war. What the US is trying to do here is, in this overextending Russia, is something similar to what they did in the 80s with the Soviet Union. They tried to overextend the Soviet Union with if you remember, Star Wars, and forced Russia to invest a lot of money into Star Wars. At a moment they didn't have the resources, so the Soviet Union imploded with the war in Afghanistan and with this Star Wars competition with the US during the Reagan administration. Now they're trying to do something similar so that they overextend in their resources, in their budget, in the war in Ukraine, and what they expect is for Russia to become implode within, like happened with the Soviet Union. That's not going to happen. The world today is very different. The world today is very, there are economic powers today that are as strong, more strong than the USA, such as China, and many emerging economic powers in the world that are now challenging USA at all levels. So the world have changed. They cannot do what they did in the 80s to the Soviet Union. This is not going to happen again. The Russians are now, despite the sanctions, they're doing very well. They're surviving these sanctions. They're moving forward into a de-dollarization of the world economy together with many other countries, including Iran. And now the USA is the one losing the battle. And this is the point that is dangerous, that if the USA see themselves losing, what I'm very concerned is what is next they're going to do, because they've been talking even about using nuclear weapons. And that's crazy talk. If you remember 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev were both nervous about the situation. They came out with a solution because they knew the consequences of that, you know. And well, now we have in Washington a crazy administration that is playing with fire and are playing, and even you see people in the USA, politicians and many people using the term nuclear war to nuke Russia. I mean, this is really we're at dangerous time, and these people are not concerned or nervous about it. They just talk about it, you know, in a very straightforward way, as if this is, you know, just something, you know, that is not going to affect anybody, you know, except Russia. This is crazy. I mean, Russia is a superpower with nuclear weapons, even as much or more than what the US has, and this could turn on into a crazy situation for the world at large. So we are in a dangerous time. I don't think Russia will lose this war. I think in the long run, the US and NATO are going to lose this one. And but in the meantime, what the US is trying to do, as I said, and it's been doing, and very successfully, is to recolonize economically European Union and bring all their companies there to make money and displace the competition. And they do it through dirty tactics, not through fair competition in the international market. So they're violating their own rules about international trade. They're just going on with crazy, dirty tactics to achieve their goals. So this is very dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. What I have three questions of you. Do you agree with this view that war between Russia and Ukraine, with any result, can start the formation of new world system based on multilateralism?
You know, as Dr.
Yeah.
Ramon said, we are moving towards a multi polar system. And from what I'm reading, and I think from what he's reading in the literature, this idea of a multipolar system is becoming a consensus among the people, the scholars who are working in this area and beyond. So beyond the academic literature, even in think tanks and even in material that is produced by the US intelligence community. The idea of this multilateral world is very much present. I have a document here. If you allow me, I will show it to you
Yeah, of
quickly.
course.
This is done. This document is is done by National Intelligence Council. As you know, we have 17 intelligence organizations that make up the U.S. intelligence community. National Intelligence Council is one of these 17 organizations, and they study trends, international trends. This is a report titled Global Trends 2030, Alternative Worlds. And so I have selected a sentence here that basically shows even the US intelligence community realizes that the United States is a power in decline, and they realize that we are moving towards a multipolar world. This is the overview of the document. It's about 160 pages, and the sentence is quite clear. There will not be any hegemonic power in 2030 based on the analysis they have. And they say they worked very hard to reach these conclusions. They have traveled to many countries, talked to a lot of scholars. This is a work that has taken a couple of years to produce. This is not a light project. Sentence is quite interesting. There will not be any hegemonic power. Power will shift to networks and coalitions in a multipolar world. And this is the type of thing that you see in other texts. For example, another text I have here is from the British Ministry of Defense. The title of this one is Global Strategic Trends, The Future Starts Today. And so they are also looking at different trends, and this part here basically is interesting because they actually reach a similar conclusion about the fact that we are moving towards multipolarity. So they say the American version is multipolar. This is multipolarity. Major powers, this is the sentence underneath. Major powers are the main international actors who form blocs with other geographically close or like-minded states, while the states within a bloc cooperate under the leadership of major power. The blocs compete for power and influence, and then this idea of network of actors and power is shared between a variety of states and non-state actors. They continue with that, with these ideas. So the conclusion that I think we can safely make is that the United States is losing its standing internationally for many, many different reasons that we don't have time to cover today, maybe. But there is a consensus that we are moving towards a multipolar world, and the idea of working together with like-minded countries to create networks and coalitions in a multipolar world becomes important. So that's the basic idea.
Thank you. I would like Dr. Grosfoguel to tell us, can the end of American unilateralism, which Fuad described for us, mean the break of United States of America?
I think that if the US will take a more realistic stand that are written in those documents presented by the colleague here, if they take a realistic stand, they should be able to survive like any other country around the world. The problem they're having is that they don't want to, all of that is written in those documents, but in fact, what they're doing is something different. What they're doing is more reflecting the overextending Russia document. What they're really doing is trying to contain the rise of the multipolar war by using dirty tactics, as I have already explained. And they're trying to use their military power or geopolitical dirty tactics in order to recover their status or try to break away from their declining power situation and try to recover markets, recover their power, and that kind of thing. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. It's all the analysis made by many academics and analysts about the future of the world economy and of the world at large, they all coincide from right to left that the US is declining and the rising power is China, and that China is going to displace the USA economically at the world scale, and that there's a multipolar war emerging, and the US is just trying to contain that. And that's crazy and dangerous. This is why it could become the end of the USA in the sense that if they fail to recover their power, most probably one thing that could happen is something that has been said by many people from right and left is the probability of a civil war inside the USA. If that happens, I think we're going to see the 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 end of the USA as we know it, because it's going to be an implosion like it happened with the Soviet Union in the 80s. It could happen with the USA. The USA is in a big crisis. The people in the USA are suffering. And now you have the emergence of extreme right groups in the USA that were in power during the Trump administration. They're now there, very well organized, and they're white supremacy militias. So you could see scenarios in the USA of having states declaring independence from the federal government of the USA because they don't want to pay the debt. They want to take responsibility for the debt. And so that's a scenario. Or you could see easily other states, such as California, that with a Republican presidency and administration, they might consider moving away. There's a movement in California calling for independence from the US government. And that happened during the Trump years. Now that Biden is in power, that kind of was put on the side because, as you know, California is Democrat. But if they see, for example, a Republican administration coming back again and doing crazy stuff against them, they most probably consider independence from them. So all these scenarios could happen, in Michigan, militias, or Dakota, South Dakota, all these white supremacy militias might consider taking over and calling for independence from the federal government and not pay the trillionaire debt of the USA. I mean, and that could end up in a civil war very easily, in a civil war. And if that happens, that's the end not only of the US empire, but the end of the USA as we know it, because then we're going to see the fragmentation of that state. And if that happens, the multipolar war will come with a force because they won't have any challenge. Because the moment USA put their energy and focus into an internal civil war, they will have to back off from the international arena. And in doing that, then the multipolar war will come with a force with no challenge and no obstacles. So I think that the USA is in a very dangerous situation and are playing with fire. Instead, even Henry Kissinger, one of the most conservative thinkers, right-wing thinkers, a guy who's responsible for genocide in the Vietnam War, in Cambodia, in Laos, in all these places. This guy is is calling attention to the Biden administration and the craziness they're doing. Like, hey, you're playing with fire. Be careful. I mean, he wrote a book about China where he's basically saying, hey, we need to accept the rise of China and just try to become partners. And even though we will be a secondary power, let's acknowledge it, like the UK, the British did with Americans. When the British declined, they just put themselves on the shoulders of the Americans and try to survive and extend their privilege in the world economy by becoming a strong partner of the USA, recognizing they're not anymore the number one. Now they're a secondary power, but they extend their economic privilege by associating with the new rising power, the USA. That's what Kissinger is recommending to do for the US with China. But that's not what the Republicans nor Democrats are doing. The powers that be in the USA right now are playing with fire. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. There's no difference. They're both doing the same thing. They're trying to impede the rise of China. They're trying to impede their decline. They're trying to, in a crazy way, dirty tactics, and that's only going to lead to a very fast and a rapid decline of the US empire. They're going to accelerate their own decline by doing these crazy things. And that's what they're doing right now. We're going to see a big collapse of the US empire, not in the 2030s. We're going to see it in this decade, in the next years. We're going to live the collapse of the US empire. This is going to happen in our lifetime.
Thank you, Raymond. Let me turn it off. Okay. Dr. Izadi, I would like to tell me if multilateralism replace unilateralism, which country or countries will be the main actor or actors in the future of the world, and what principle will this country replace the previous principle? And in continuous, can we expect new changes in the United Nations and Security Council?
You know, from what I understand, and I hope you asked the same question from Dr. Ramon to see what he thinks. But since World War II until about 10 years ago or so, we had the world economy becoming integrated and closer as we progressed in the last 70, 80 years under WTO regulations and the policies of the major economies. And in the last several years, as we are moving towards a multipolar world, countries like China are realizing what the United States is doing. They want to unbalance Russia, they want to unbalance China, they have been trying to unbalance Iran for the last 40 years. So as more countries realize this fact, they will try to separate themselves from the pressures of the United States, weaponizing dollar, sanctioning them, causing difficulties for ordinary citizens in these countries. And as Dr. Ramon said earlier, they are trying to move away from dollar. Why are they trying to do that? Because they realize what the US is doing to dollar in terms of advancing foreign policy goals. They are countries like Russia and China are creating banking messaging systems that are going to compete with SWIFT, for example. They are using local currencies for trade between countries. And they're trying to become less dependent from the West as they progress. And the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States are competing as we speak on which one is more anti-China and more anti-Russia, especially China. So the Western economy is moving away and separating from the rest of the world, or the rest of the world is separating itself from the Western economy. And as this happens, you're going to have, in that multipolar world, you're going to have a number of Western governments in Europe, not all European countries, but some European countries, that are going to be led by the United States. So you're going to have this bloc, and then you're going to have these non-Western countries that are not going to accept American lead when it comes to international relations. So that is going to, these non-Western countries, that's going to include China, Russia, Iran. Even, when the United States wanted to take a vote at the United Nations against Russia, some of US allies, like Brazil, did not vote yes. Mexico has a long border with the United States. They did not vote yes. India did not vote yes. Of course, Iran and China did not vote yes. So, so that is going to be one block, and then you're going to have a number of blocks in the non-Western countries. And this is actually good news for people in the South, the global South, and people in countries like Iran that have been under a lot of pressure in the last 40 years, because when you had the unipolar system with the American leadership, they faced a lot of difficulties. As we move towards a multipolar world, we are going to see more opportunities for countries like Iran. Now, let me share another page in this document that we looked at earlier. I hope this is available for you to see.
Yeah.
This is the same Global Trends 2030 National Intelligence Council that American intelligence community organization. This is quite interesting about the future of economic power. This sentence I'm reading, just as important, the economies of other non-Western states such as Colombia, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, South Africa, Mexico, Turkey, and others that are middle tier today could rise by 2030. So Iran and a number of other states that are mentioned here are second tier countries, obviously, and the idea of their economies rising is especially interesting for Iran, because Iran has been under a lot of economic pressure. So the idea of Iran advancing at the same time that they are experiencing sanctions in this American intelligence community document is interesting. The sentence continues, individually, most of these countries will remain second-order players because China and India are so large. However, as a collective group, they will begin to suppress Europe, Japan, and Russia in terms of global power by 2030. This is interesting. If they work by themselves, they are going to be second tier even in 2030. But if they work together, then they can, interestingly, suppress Europe. And this is one of the points that Professor Ramon had. How could they suppress Europe? Because Europe is becoming weak. Or in his terminology, they're becoming colonized again by the United States, and that makes them weak. So countries that are not necessarily in line with those ideas are going to actually advance. The paragraph continues. Our modeling shows, for example, that this group of rapidly developing middle-tier countries, the Goldman Sachs Next 11. Now, of course, you know Goldman Sachs is this major financial institution company in the United States, and they have a list of this Next 11. Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran is again here, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, South Africa, Turkey, and Vietnam. So this is a little different, but Iran is actually on both lists. Will collectively overtake EU 27 in global power by 2030. So if these 11 countries work with each other, they actually can be a bigger power than EU 27. So when we look at this type of texts, we realize that the world is changing, because when you look at the world economy, maybe 70 or 80 years ago, you had the British first, and then you had the French, and then you had the Germans. Now you have the Americans, Chinese, and then as we go forward, you're going to see some of these other countries, if they work together, actually are going to move up in those type of rankings. So because of these facts, I think we are happy to say that we are moving towards a better world. we are moving towards a better world, and we need good professors like Professor Ramon to lead us in strategies that we need to adopt to make sure that this transition is going to be a smooth transition. I probably should have done this earlier, but we need to thank this institution for paying attention to these ideas, because this is where the world is moving. And as we talk about these things and share ideas and share concepts, I think the better we are going to be in terms of making sure that the transition is done in a proper manner.
Thank you. I hope so, as you mentioned, that emerging countries and emerging power can change the classic infrastructure, global infrastructure, as a matter of fact, the hegemonic infrastructure of the international system. My last question to Professor Grosfoguel is, this question is not very directly related to the Ukraine and Russia war. As I mentioned in the beginning of this meeting, we are going to do foresight about the future trends and events around the globe, which will affect our society, which will affect our science and technology. From this point of view, I would like to know that according to the current and emerging trends and events in New World, what change do you think culture and science will experience? Raman, sorry, we don't have your voice. Could you please turn on your microphone? My colleagues, can you help? Yes, it's on. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think that the science and technology, we need to decolonize science and technology. I mean, this is a challenge we have. When I say we, is the people who are struggling against this unipolar world led by the US empire together with the secondary allies such as European imperialist countries. I think that we need to decolonize science, because right now we have a science that has been instrumental for the killing of humanity. I mean, the Western science, if you remember, in the early period, they basically took, because the West at that moment was mostly Europe, the medieval Europe was very obscurantist, because they were under the rule of Christendom. Christendom, I'm not talking about Christianity, I'm talking about Christendom, when they use Christianity as a power structure and they distort the messages of the theology and distort the theology for the benefit of the rich people and powerful people. That's Christendom, that's not Christianity. So when they were in the civilization of Christendom, they have to take a lot of the scientific knowledge from Islamic civilization, because Islamic civilization was way advanced in science and technology. And when they took a lot of the knowledges from Islamic civilization, because they have Islamic civilization at their borders, they appropriated these scientific and technological advances without the ethics of the spirituality of Islam. That means they appropriated these knowledges. I call it epistemic extractivism, because then when you read history of science, they all begin to talk as if all these discoveries in science and technology were made by a white man in Europe. History of science is full of white supremacy garbage. We need to decolonize history of science. I just give you one example. Copernicus, that is supposedly the guy who discovered that the earth is going around the sun and is not the center, and it's not the other way around, it's not the center of the universe, and all of this. This was developed by the School of Damascus, astronomical school of Damascus, in 300 years before Copernicus. Copernicus took this knowledge from the school of Damascus, and then when he wrote his text, he made mathematical mistakes that were not there in the original discoveries of the school of astronomical school of Damascus. So then it passed on to history. That is Copernicus who invented or discovered these things. And the school of Damascus is buried in history. So we need to decolonize science. Because what happened then was that they were then appropriating these knowledges and taking away the spirituality of the Islamic sciences. What I mean by this is that when in the modern world, they start taking all these knowledges from other scientific discoveries, from other civilizations, because they were in a very obscurantist period in Europe. They couldn't do science because they will bury alive scientists, because they will say they're playing with evil forces, because they saw nature as something of evil, of Satan, of something negative. So anybody who was working scientifically with science was suspicious of being evil, with evil forces, and they will burn them alive. This was happening. So when they start, coming into scientific developments, they have to then throw away. They throw away the spirituality, and now we have a science without spirituality. They appropriated science from Islamic civilization, but throw away the spirituality. What does that mean? Now you have a science without spirituality. A science without spirituality is a science without ethics. A science without ethics is a science where everything goes. A science where everything goes is a fetishistic, idolatry science, shirk in Islam. And a sign that is shirk, that is idolatric, is a sign destructive of life, because everything could be justified in the name of science with no limits. It becomes the new religion, science. And so in the modern world, we have a sign destructive of life, because all it takes is for a scientist to say, this is my discovery, and this is what we should do, and everybody follow, even though that could destroy the planet, that could destroy the life in the planet, and that's what we have in the modern world, a science destructive of life. So we need to decolonize that and begin to have an ethics in scientific production where it put limits to science to protect life in planet Earth, and this is what I call a science for life, not a science for death. And that's the challenges we have in the global South against these Eurocentric sciences that are just destroying life in planet Earth. This is one of the main challenges we have. And in terms of technology, we need to decolonize from Cartesian dualism. The cosmology of the West is Cartesian dualism. The stupid idea that human life is ontologically separated, dualistically separated from other forms of life. So they split nature from human life, and so they start developing, because every technology has a cosmology. There's no technology without cosmology. This is a myth that technology is neutral. That's not true. Technology is always produced from within a cosmology. So if your cosmology is Cartesian dualism, you're going to destroy life in planet Earth, because you have the stupid idea that you can, develop technology that could destroy anything around you. You don't have any limit, because you have thought that human life is isolated, insulated from other forms of life. So you could destroy anything around you, and it doesn't affect human life. This is the stupid idea they have. And they've been, for 400 years, we've been in the West and in the world at large, because of colonization of the West through all the cultures, we've been using technology based on dualistic Cartesian cosmology, destructive of life, because we have technology that have there the rationality of the destruction of life. In contrast, in all the civilization before the Europeans, before this modern European-centered world that we have today, all the civilization have a holistic understanding between the human life and other forms of life, independently of the differences in cosmology of all these civilizations. They all understood a holistic the holistic idea that human life is dependent over all the life that surrounds you. And if you destroy everything around you, you destroy yourself. So the only way for life to survive is to have developed technology that take care of the reproduction of life, not of the destruction of life, because otherwise you're destroying your own self. And that was common sense in all the civilization before. Now we have a civilization. That's why I don't talk about this idea of Anthropocene. I talk about Western scene because it's Western civilization that is at the center of the destruction of life in planet Earth for the past 400 years. And before that, human beings have been in planet Earth for thousands of years, and we haven't destroyed life in planet Earth. All the other civilizations have a respect for the surrounding ecology and life in the planet. Now, with this civilization, we need to decolonize ourselves from this false idea that technology is neutral and that the dualistic, the Cartesian dualistic paradigm that you could, develop any technology without taking consideration the reproduction of life and just build technology that could destroy anything as long as it serves the purpose of what you want, then it doesn't matter because human life is supposed to be insulated, isolated from the life around you, and you will survive even if you destroy the life of nature around you. This is a stupid idea that we need to decolonize from, and we need to train the scientists in schools about this question so that when they develop new technologies in the future, they take into consideration the respect for the surrounding ecology and life that are around us. So this is one of the main challenges we face, moving from a science of death of Western civilization into a science of life that is the science that was produced by the people of the world and by all civilization before this destructive Western civilization that is putting life, not only human life, but all forms of life at stake. We don't even know how long we'll be here in planet Earth in the next hundreds of years with this ecological disaster they have created. And this to say that this is Anthropocene, that the scientists identify the moment when human came into the cycles of destruction of life in the 17th century. And they say that from then on, humans enter into the cycle of reproduction of life, destructing life. But they're talking about humans as if it's a neutral thing. No, it's not human that have been destroying life. It's the Western civilization and the logic of Cartesian dualism that, by the way, was created in the 17th century, exactly when the scientists identified this moment, and it's at the peak of the expansion, colonial expansion of Western civilization around the world, imposing this stupid idea of Cartesian dualism that today is putting life at stake in planet Earth.
Thank you. Developing science and technology without spirituality or without ethics, not only they are not gonna be helpful, but they will be harmful for society and humanity. In the end of this event, I would like to ask the audience who participate online and who physically come in this hall. I would like to ask them if they have any question. Dr. Gholami, the floor is yours. Dr. Gholami, the chairman of the Institute of Social and Cultural Studies.
Thank you for accepting the invitation of the Institute. The discussions of the meeting very, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Grosfoguel and Professor Izadi. Especially, I would like to have a discussion about Islamic new civilization and Islamic humanities in the future with Dr. Grosfoguel. This is my scientific interest. I have a question from Dr. Izadi. Can the method that the Americans have taken to change the world conditions in their favor, such as designing and creating a rebellion in Iran, help them these conditions, for example, rebellion in Iran, help them in this situation?
You know,
And excuse me, Iran was almost able to overcome this challenge. Some things that American has entered into a dangerous gamble. Maybe American wants to use this method, I mean rebellion, in Russia and China. These conditions can also be designed for American too. You know, and you said, I think, uh, internal condition in United States are not good. What's your idea about this?
you know, before I answer that question, I have a suggestion for this institute to because Dr. Ramon has specialized in decolonizing science and also decolonizing university, because that science is taught through the university systems, and uh, I'm sorry to say that the Iranian universities also are affected, but by what he was talking about. So I think his insights are going to be important. So this is a suggestion for a topic that we can cover sometime in the future. Uh, with regard to your question, I think there are three countries in the world that have the power to increase the speed of American decline. And these three countries are Iran, China, and Russia. Among the three countries, Iran has been advocating this culture of resistance for the last 43 years. And in more recent years, we have Russia and China joining this culture of resistance. After the fall of the Soviet Union, we had the Russian government very much trying to be part of Western Europe and be like any other Western-oriented country. It was the United States that did not accept that idea, and they started fighting with Russia, and we talked about the Ukraine war. China, similarly, moved away from some of the basic principles of communism, and Chinese economy became very much a capitalist economy. But nowadays, I think they realize that the process that was taken after the normalization of US-China relations cannot continue because of the hostilities they're facing from the United States. So Russia is saying no to the United States. China is saying no to the United States. And Iran has been saying no to the United States for the last 40 years, sooner than these other two countries. So that is why you see a lot of hostilities. I need to admit this, that although the United States is declining in terms of economic power, in terms of political power, in terms of soft power, in terms of the power of creating institutions, they are not declining in propaganda power. The United States is actually doing quite well when it comes to propaganda. And they use this power to influence public opinion internationally. They use this power to influence public opinion in these three countries that I mentioned. The excuse they had with Iran was with regard to the hijab, the headscarf. In China, the ladies don't have the culture of the religion of wearing hijab. So what do they have been doing in China in the last few days? The COVID policies of the Chinese government. So you have some fire in some city. You know, China is a very populated country. 1.34 billion people live there. In a country with over a billion people, you're going to have fires every night almost. So blaming the deaths of those fires on the Chinese government and trying to create riots in China using propaganda, or what they have been doing in Russia in terms of similar tactics. I think one of the reasons Russia started saying no to the United States because they realized that this idea of a hybrid warfare is very much part of American policy towards Russia, and the example that Dr. Rahman had with regard to the 2019 RAND Corporation report is an indication for that. So it is understandable why United States is so hostile to these two countries, because these three countries are not taking dictates from the United States. With regard to United States itself, here I differ a little bit from Dr. Ramon. Of course, you need to trust him more because he's in California. He's based there. There have been separatist groups trying to separate California or Texas or other states, but they have not been very strong. So I think that is not going to happen in the near future or in medium term. The idea of decline, as we talked about, is almost accepted by everybody. But the idea of US collapsing, there's a difference between collapse and decline. Collapse is what happened to the Soviet Union. That there are some indications for collapse, there are some indications that collapse is not. But the fact that the US is declining is not a small factor. You know, when you look at the world history, in the 16th century, you had the Portuguese becoming a superpower. They took over a large portion of South America. They even came to Iran and took over some areas in Iran. There are some castles, remains of castles of Portuguese in southern Iran. They declined. You had the Spanish in the 17th century becoming a superpower. They declined. You had the French becoming a superpower in the 18th century. They declined. You had the British becoming a superpower in the 19th century. They declined. And then you have the United States becoming a superpower in the 20th century, and they're declining as we speak. And the previous governments that were a superpower at a period have become more or less normal countries. So they're not engaging in this type of aggressive behavior. Portugal and Spain are not causing the type of problems they used to cause at the time that they were superpowers. And the result is that the sooner the United States becomes a normal country, then a lot of difficulties that exist in the world will go away. So the future of the United States, I think, is going to be something like Brazil. Brazil is a large country. It has a large population. It has a lot of resources. But Brazil is not having the final say in international relations as we speak. Although it's a large country, it doesn't have the power that the United States once had. And in the next number of decades, I think United States will follow that path. And so the country, and I think this is one thing that Dr. Rahman said, that the US basically will not be what the US is today because of the mistakes they have made, and because of the crimes that the US government has committed. And I believe the people in the United States are the first victims of the US government policies. For example, in Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico, have been suffering from US colonialism for many, many years now. And the indigenous people in the United States, the minorities, the Hispanic minorities, the black minorities. And sooner or later, these type of crimes are going to result in a change. And as you know, in the United States, we are also looking at a demographic change. So based on US Census Bureau data, by 2045, they're predicting that the majority white people are going to be a minority. And so the minorities are going to become majority. 2045 is just 23 years from now. It's not very far away. And that is why the scholarship that Dr. Ramon is producing is going to be important, because this minority is going to need knowledge for the time that they become majority. And producing that knowledge is going to be more important now. So let me stop. I think I talked too long.
Do you have any other question? Okay, Raymond, there is one question for you in chat box, and if you want to add something, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just want to say that the scenario of a civil war in the United States is something that many people are calling attention to. This is not just me. This is from right to left in the USA. There is a concern that this might turn out to be, a reality. The polarization in the USA is big. Everybody has weapons. This is not a country with people without weapons. Everybody has weapons, and there are militias organized across the country already that are ready to go into warfare. And this is when I say California. I was not saying that California is going to become independent. I'm saying I don't know what will trigger the civil war. I mentioned scenarios. Maybe it's with a Republican president. You might have white supremacy militias going around the country, and then some democratic states deciding to push for independence, or maybe vice versa, Democrat, and maybe you have states in the U.S. calling to independence from the federal government. So I'm just talking about scenarios, okay, of possibilities. I'm not saying this is going to happen like this, okay? So please, I'm trying to qualify what I said, because maybe it was misunderstood. I didn't explain it well. But this is what I'm saying, that there is a concern, not by me, by many analysts in the USA today, that are saying that the trends, the way they're moving forward in the USA, is that there might be a civil war in the USA, and this, you could see the symptoms of this in the 6th January assault of the Congress, of U.S. Congress, led by Donald Trump and white supremacist groups, and there were people killed there, and basically the white supremacists are organized also among the police, and so they have like a green light to enter the Congress. I mean, they were not stopped by the police. The police collaborated with them, to take over the Congress. So the police is infiltrated by these white supremacist groups all over the country. I mean, I'm saying this is a scenario, a plausible scenario, and we might see the collapse of the USA in this decade, at the end of this decade, not next decade, because this is a serious discussion in the US today. I invite you to go over the internet and read the discussions going on about this. And people are very concerned about this because of the polarization going on in this country, together with the economic crisis. We need to understand that US people are suffering hyperinflation, are suffering from this, corporate welfare, who are taking taxpayers' money for their own businesses and leaving people welfare out of the window. So people are suffering. So the problem with this is that many times in economic crisis, the white working classes are very attractive to extreme right rhetoric, racist, and all of this. And so they are suffering, but instead of channeling their discontent against the Pentagon, against that it's taking away all their taxpayers' money, or against Wall Street that is stealing away their money, or against the US government that is doing crazy stuff around the world that is affecting their life there, hyperinflation with the war in Ukraine and so on, people are reacting in the US right now. And the problem is that the reaction is that people are taking more string right positions. And this can turn into a civil war because demographically, as Dr. Izadi said, there's a turnaround of the demography, and there also the white groups, white working classes suffering in the crisis and being told that the problem is the Latinos or the blacks, not the system. So they channel their discontent against these other groups. And so you could see easily, and you saw that during the potential of this during the years of Trump, where you have these white supremacy groups going around the country. You have all this Black Lives Matter movement and the repression over that movement by the Trump administration and so on. I mean, it could turn, anything could trigger a civil war in the USA because everybody has weapons. So this is my concern, what I'm trying to say, that there is a scenario, we know the international scenario very well about the decline of the US empire. We know very well the emergence of the multipolar world. We know all that very well. We know what they're doing in Ukraine and what is their agenda and what the US is trying to achieve and all of this. What people don't know well is what is happening domestically inside the empire. And I invite you to study that because that's a variable that could come in and turn around everything we're predicting about the international arena in an unexpected way. So this is why I'm saying, watch it, because there is a potential civil war there. If that happens internationally, the whole thing will turn around, I would say, in a more positive way. I'm not deciding a civil war anywhere in the world, not even in the US. I live in the USA. I don't want a civil war. But if this happens, the reality is, independently if you like it or not, is that the USA will have to back off from the international arena, from their piracy and imperialist policy, and will have to turn their attention to the civil war, and that will create then a very good scenario for the multipolar war to emerge, and then in terms of decolonization of knowledge and decolonization of science and university, this is a central issue for countries that have done anti-imperialist revolutions. You have inherited a educational structural system from the old regime that was in the hands of US empire, in the hands of the West, with curriculum and universities that were mostly based on Western-centric knowledges. And the problem with that is that instead of the new revolutions creating new curriculums to decolonize knowledge and to decolonize the universities, the Cuban Revolution, Venezuelan Revolution, many revolutions around the world, they just leave the universities as they are. They don't change curriculum. They don't decolonize the university knowledge production. And then when you open your eyes, you are producing a lot of technological people with technological knowledge, scientific knowledge, but in the subjectivity, they're colonized by the West. And so they benefit from the revolution by having access to degrees in universities and so on. And then when they get their degrees, they turn against the revolution because they haven't been, there's no shift in their mindset, and what they're learning in the university is not helping them to move away from Western-centric, Eurocentric colonial knowledge production. So that's not only in the social science and humanities, that's also in the natural science, in in the traditional natural science programs, because we need to decolonize knowledge. You know, the priority, one of the priorities of President Maduro in Venezuela is to decolonize science, is to decolonize. The Minister of Science in Venezuela today is calling to decolonize science and technology, because it has political consequences if you don't do that, because you're doing a revolution with right-wing epistemology, and you cannot do and move forward and do a revolution with a right-wing history of science or knowledge about science, technology, and whatever, because those people you are forming in your university will be your own enemies. You're just producing people who will turn against you. You know, this is crazy. And this is why President Maduro in Venezuela have called attention to decolonize education, to decolonize technology, to decolonize science, to decolonize the forms inherited from the old regime. Because if you don't do that, you're just shooting your own feet, because you will produce there, you don't change the mental shift of the people, these people will turn against you because they are Western-centric. You know, so the issue about decolonizing the university, decolonizing social science, decolonizing the humanities, decolonizing natural science programs and departments is a strategic issue for any revolution in the world today. If you don't do that, you're just, moving forward, to basically destroy yourself with the best intentions in the world. So this is why I'm saying decolonization of knowledge, decolonization of science and technology, decolonization of universities is a central issue. How to do that? Invite me to another seminar. I will explain to you how to do that.
Thank you. I hope you have your next event. There is just one last question from Ms. Gul Mohammadi. Let me to read this question for you, and I would like to ask you to answer us briefly to finish this event on time. She asks, currently everyone believes that Russia cannot leave this war without achievements. What is the solution that can preserve Russia's face and reputation, and at the same time not cause further destruction of Ukraine?
Is that for me?
Yes, she asked from you.
Yeah, I think that the Russians have been very careful so far in how they are developing this war. They haven't used the best military technology there. They haven't used it because they don't want to create a situation like the US does in Iraq or does in other places, that they just go there in the first few days, they kill millions of people, and they call it as an I'm sorry?
Collateral damage.
Thank you. They call it collateral damage. And then they kill a lot of people, innocent people. The Russians have been very careful in not doing that. And we need to acknowledge that. They haven't used their best weapon. They're being very strategic about what to target. They're targeting mostly military bases and military, radar systems, communicational systems. Lately, because of the nature of the war, they've been targeting some of the electrical power and things like that affect the military movements and mobility. That also is affecting some of the civil population, of course. But we need to acknowledge that they've been very careful. I don't know how far they can go with this, or how far they're going to continue doing that. I hope they continue doing that. But I think that there's no way Ukraine can sustain themselves in the face of the Russian intervention. There's no way. I think Russia will win in the long run this war, and I think that the West is going to just to try to extend it as long as they can, in order to, as they say, overextend Russia and try to implode Russia like they did with the Soviet Union in the 80s. But that's not going to happen because the world have changed for good compared to the 80s.
Thank you, Ramon. Well, there is a lot there. We want to thank you, Ramon Grosfoguel, Professor of Latino Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, speaking to us from Berkeley, and Professor Foad Izadi, Professor of American Studies in Faculty of World Studies, speaking to us from here in Tehran. I appreciate so much everybody being prepared to have this debate. I hope to see you next time in our next series of this New Words series, next event. I want to buy now. Bye.
Take care. See you next
Thank you
time.
very much.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.